Hi everyone. Welcome to my channel International Storyteller. In this channel you will find true horror stories worldwide. These stories are for entertainment purposes only. In this video, I will tell you the story of the White Witch of Rose Hall, which is the most haunted mansion in Jamaica. Jamaica is an island in the Caribbean Sea. The Caribbean is a small region near the North and South American mainland that consists of the Caribbean Sea and its islands, surrounded by the Caribbean Sea and the North Atlantic Ocean. The region is located at the southeast corner of the Gulf of Mexico and the North American mainland, east of Central America, and north of South America. This is the place where the Hollywood movie Pirates of the Caribbean was shot. The Caribbean region has more than 700 large and small islands. Jamaica is one such island situated in the Caribbean. There are many historic locations in Jamaica, and for this reason many tourists want to visit Jamaica during their vacation. One popular tourist destination in Jamaica is the famous mansion known as the Rose Hall Plantation House. Once, there were around 700 mansions in Jamaica whose owners were the wealthy plantation whites from Europe. Out of the 700 mansions that once belonged to the wealthy plantation owners, only 15 houses remain today. The other houses having been burned to the ground by slaves during the Great Jamaican Slave Revolt in the years 1831-1832. Out of the remaining 15 houses, the most well-known and famous is Rose Hall. Rose Hall is one of the most famous houses in Jamaica because it has an incredible history. The Rose Hall has become so famous that it has become one of the most popular tourist attractions in Jamaica. The first reason for the tourist attraction is because the house and the surrounding area of Rose Hall are very beautiful and extremely impressive. Rose Hall was sometimes called the Calendar House because it originally had 365 windows, which is similar to having 365 days in a year, 52 doors, which is similar to having 52 weeks in a year, and 12 bedrooms, which is similar to having 12 months in a year. This house was built on the coast of Montego Bay in the 1770s. It has a dramatic-looking three-story building and is situated high atop a hillside, giving it a spectacular view of the sea and the golf course that now occupies the former sugar plantation grounds. John Palmer was one of the former owners of Rose Hall, who owned and operated the mansion primarily as a sugarcane plantation. During the sugarcane plantation era in Jamaican history, the rich white people owned the land. They bought the black people from Africa and forced them to work at the sugarcane plantation as slaves. Those black slaves working on the plantation were treated very cruelly by the plantation owners. The cruel plantation owners would place bear traps around the plantation area, but you should know there aren't any bears in Jamaica. The only reason for putting bear traps around the plantation area is to catch the slaves who are trying to run away. That is why there are many bear traps in Jamaican museums. At one time in Jamaican history, Rose Hall was one of the largest sugarcane plantations in Jamaica, reportedly having more than 2,000 slaves working in the fields. During that time, the Rose Hall was controlled by a famous witch called Annie Palmer, who was the husband of John Palmer. Till today, Jamaicans call John Palmer's wife, Annie Palmer, who lives at the Rose Hall house, as the White Witch of Rose Hall. For years, the Rose Hall house has been a popular destination for tourists, as well as local people who live in Jamaica, because of its association with the legend of the White Witch of Rose Hall. The Rose Hall is considered one of the most haunted houses not only in Jamaica but also in the world. It is believed that the house is still haunted by the spirit of its former John Palmer wife, Annie Palmer, whom the Jamaican people called the White Witch of Rose Hall. Many people have made claims about the sightings of the ghost of Annie Palmer roaming through the house. Michael Rollins, who was the vice president of finance and marketing for Rose Hall Developments Limited, while documenting the history of Rose Hall, has experienced many paranormal activities in the house. Another story about hauntings in Rose Hall includes the ghost hunters Hans Holzer and Eileen Garrett. Eileen Garrett, born on March 17, 1893, was an Irish parapsychologist, a field of study that is concerned with the investigation of evidence for paranormal psychological phenomena. Ghost hunter Hans Holzer claims that Annie Palmer's ghost once took over the body of Eileen Garrett while investigating evidence for paranormal activities inside the Rose Hall. The fact that Annie Palmer, also known as the White Witch, now supposedly haunts Rose Hall, makes this house even more interesting. After Annie's death, the beautiful great house fell into ruins and was left abandoned for more than 130 years. Then the former 14th Lieutenant Governor of the U.S. state of Delaware, John Rawlins, bought the Rose Hall plantation house in the 1960s. He then restored the Rose Hall house to its former beauty and made it one of the most popular tourist destinations in Jamaica. The plantation is now owned by John Rawlins and his wife, former Miss World USA Michelle Rawlins. It is now open to the public, and guests are able to participate in day and night tours in and around the house. They took a lot of care to match the house with the original style and furnishings of the house. One of the few original pieces of Rose House that is said to be haunted is the small but beautifully decorated mirror in Annie's bedroom. Many tourists, while looking at the beautifully decorated mirror hanging inside Annie's bedroom, saw the reflection of the ghost of Annie inside the mirror. Today, the Rose Hall house is one of the most popular tourist attractions in Jamaica. The tour itself lasted about an hour and ended at the grave of Annie, which is located on the back side of the house. Tourists visit this house every day. It was drawn by the legend of Annie Palmer, also known as the White Witch of Rose Hall. There are 2 tour times available, that is, a day tour and a night tour. The tour guide lady at Rose Hall will ask the tourist if he or she is scared of ghosts. If they are scared of ghosts, the tourist guide lady will not allow a night tour and offer them only a day tour of Rose Hall. Many tourists, after visiting the house, discover unusual and ghostly photographs while taking photos inside the house using their camera. This reminds them that the presence of Annie Palmer's ghost inside the Rose Hall is still evident today. Nobody has ever had the nerve to stay in Rose Hall overnight alone. Many people had planned on staying a full night, but none of them made it through the whole night. They reported lots of strange disturbances, such as hearing the sound of strange footsteps coming out of an empty room and sound of smashing things on the floor. There are many scary moments while touring inside the Rose Hall. Some of the scariest moments included hearing the sound of the old tree branches scratching the old wall and faint echoes of footsteps coming down the crumbling stairs. As they climbed the path to the grand stairs that led them up to the house, they could feel the anticipation growing in the air, and the nervous laughter increased with each step. A scary incident happened to a group of people while they were touring the second floor of the Rose Hall. While they were touring inside a sewing room on the second floor, one woman in the group suddenly collapsed without any reason. Everyone was very scared and shocked, and they thought they would never go inside the sewing room again. Since then, the sewing room on the second floor of Rose Hall has been locked till today. There is also a scary room inside the Rose Hall that has a strange painting of Annie hanging on the wall. If someone is walking near that painting hanging on the wall, they will notice that Annie's eyes follow them as they move. Similarly, when someone was walking inside the Rose Hall, they felt like the evil spirit of Annie was watching them from the corner of the house. For the night tour, visitors are led through the house by candlelight. The night tour is very spooky, and for this reason, anyone who is easily frightened is not allowed to tour the house at night by the tour guide, who instead asks them to go on the day tour. A well-trained guide told the shocking history of the house while moving from one room to another. There is a very rich history connected to Rose Hall. There is something about Rose Hall and its history that is sure to draw anyone's attention in it, and they will feel themselves being connected to this house and the history behind it. Those visitors will feel as if they have stepped back in time when the tour guide tells the past history of the house. The tour guides tell the story of Annie, who is also known as the White Witch of Rose Hall, and how she terrorized the house during her life and sent everyone running in fear when they saw her. The tour guides also tell the story of many ghost sightings of her around the Rose Hall since her death. There is a scary story in Jamaica, often told by the Jamaican grandfather or father to their children. A story of witchcraft, black magic, murder, romance, and even betrayal. This is the story of Annie Palmer, the infamous owner of the Rose Hall plantation. The folklore of Annie Palmer has been told and retold countless times. Who was she actually? What was her motivation? How did she become known to Jamaicans as the White Witch of Rose Hall? And why did she haunt the house after she died? In order to know this, let us hear the story of Annie Palmer, the White Witch of Rose Hall. The story of Rose Hall begins in the year 1746, when an Englishman by the name of Henry Fanning falls in love with an Irish girl named Rosa Kelly. The Irish are the people who live in Ireland. Rosa Kelly was the daughter of Irish immigrants living on the island of Jamaica. So Henry Fanning went to Jamaica in search of his lover, Rosa Kelly. After Henry found his lover, they began preparing for marriage. Since Rosa Kelly's family is an immigrant, they don't have any land. So Henry purchased a 290-acre plot of land for cultivation and built a house on it. Henry and Rosa were married in 1747, but unfortunately, Henry died just a few months later after the wedding. Then, 3 years later, in 1750, Rosa married George, a wealthy landowner in Louisiana, which is a state in the USA. George immediately built a beautiful mansion house for Rosa, who was living in Jamaica. Sadly, after the construction of the beautiful mansion was completed, George died in 1752. In 1768, Rosa met an Englishman, John Palmer, who was the owner of the neighboring Palmyra estate and the custodian of St. James Parish in Jamaica. Palmer was also a widower whose wife died early and had 2 sons living in England. A few days later, Rosa and John Palmer got married. They had a happy marriage that lasted until Rosa's death in 1790, and John died 7 years later, in 1797. Because John and Rosa had no children together, the Rose Hall and Palmyra estates were left in trust for John's sons in England. But the sons never went to Jamaica to claim Rose Hall in the estate. Rosa and John Palmer didn't have any other children to pass the property of Rose Hall upon their deaths. So the ownership of the Rose Hall plantation was passed to John Palmer's grandnephew John Rose Palmer. Thus, when the original owners of Rose Hall passed away, the house and the plantation were handed down through the family. It eventually landed in the hands of John Rose Palmer, who was the grandnephew of John Palmer. In 1818, John Rose Palmer moved to Jamaica from England and took charge of the house. After John Rose Palmer took charge of the house, it came to be known as Rose Hall because the property belonged to the Rose family. Soon afterward, he found Annie Patterson and fell in love with her. Then he married Annie Patterson, making her Annie Palmer, and it was she who became known as the White Witch of Rose Hall. How does John meet Annie, and why was Annie known as the White Witch of Rose Hall? In order to know this, let us continue hearing the story. Annie Palmer was born in England, and her actual name was Annie May Patterson. She is the daughter of an English mother and an Irish father. Her family belongs to the middle class. During the years 1754-1780, there was high economic prosperity for the European people doing business on the islands of the Caribbean Sea. So Annie's family decided to move to Haiti, which is also an island near Jamaica. During that time, a deadly war similar to World War I, known as the 7 Years' War, broke out in Europe. Even though the war broke out in Europe, the Haiti island was gaining huge economic profit from exporting large quantities of raw and refined sugar to Europe. As a result of war in Europe and economic prosperity in Haiti, the Annie family decided to leave Europe and move to Haiti. Annie was just 10 years old when she arrived in Haiti. She was a happy child and quickly settled into her new life in Haiti, which was a French colony at that time. There she became fascinated with all aspects of her new home in Haiti, and she was taken care of by a nanny. Just a few days after they settled in Haiti, a serious disease called yellow fever spread across the island of Haiti. Yellow fever is a disease caused by infected mosquitoes and insects. Annie lost both of her parents to yellow fever, and she was just 10 years old when her parents died. She was still young when her parents died and left her as an orphan with no living relatives on the island. But fortunately, Annie's nanny took on the responsibility of raising her. The nanny adopted young Annie and raised her just like her own daughter. While the nanny was taking care of Annie, Annie came to know that her nanny was not just a normal woman, but a witch who knew black magic and the art of voodoo traditions. Annie asked her nanny to teach her the art of voodoo tradition and black magic. Since the nanny considered Annie as her own daughter, she taught the little girl the secret of practicing black magic and voodoo. The nanny also taught Annie how to become a master of all the dark magic, including seduction. That is how she allegedly learned witchcraft and voodoo. Annie was eager to learn and loved the results produced by the abilities of black magic. Her voodoo practices grew stronger day by day, and at the end she became an expert in black magic and voodoo. Beside her ability to perform black magic and voodoo, Annie was also a beautiful young woman. Her nanny, who was alleged to be a voodoo expert, taught Annie how to use her beauty and her black magic skills to get what she wanted. During that time, Haiti was ripe with turmoil and chaos from a revolution waged by its enslaved black people toward the French colony. Many French white people, including women and children, were killed by the angry enslaved black people. As Annie grew up in Haiti, she experienced such slave rebellions. There was uncertainty and danger in every part of Haiti. The slaves at this time freely roamed the streets, and with their hearts filled with revenge, they would not have a second thought about hurting or killing a white woman. This war made it very unsafe for many white people settling in Haiti. This resulted in Annie's desire to leave the island when she reached maturity. When Annie was about 18 years old, her nanny suddenly died. After her nanny's death and when she felt very lonely, Annie then moved to the island of Jamaica in search of a new life. During that time, Jamaica was a British colony, with many rich Englishmen doing business on the island. Annie also wanted to become a rich and wealthy person. So, she used her black magic skills to get herself a rich husband. Soon after she arrived in Jamaica, she met John Palmer, the owner of Rose Hall and the vast sugar plantation near Montego Bay. When John saw Annie for the first time, he fell deeply in love with her because of her beauty and charm. Later, he proposed marriage to her, which Annie accepted happily. But many believe that she cast a spell on the owner of Rose Hall estate, John Palmer, and trapped him into marriage with her. Due to Annie's powerful dark magic skills, John Palmer crossed her path and fell in love with her immediately. Thus Annie became the mistress of Rose Hall House, which has a vast and famous sugar plantation, and is regarded as the finest great house on the island of Jamaica. Annie was happy, and for a while, it seemed that while she was staying in Rose Hall, she was getting everything she ever wanted. She and her husband managed the sugar plantation with over 2,000 slaves. She loved riding across the Rose Hall plantation and viewing the operations of the sugarcane plantation. At times, she could be seen standing on her balcony, monitoring the slaves and their daily work. But Annie Palmer was a hard woman to satisfy. Since John has focused more time on his business and sugar plantation. So most of the time he spent less time with his wife Annie. As a result, after a few months of their wedding, Annie started to feel that her husband John was supposedly very neglectful of her, which she did not like. After that, Annie became lonely and bored with her husband and the life of a little housewife. After marriage, the relationship between John and his wife Annie grew more distant, and it seems to Annie like she is no longer living with her husband. Rose Hall was a famous sugar plantation in Jamaica, with an abundance of more than 2,000 slaves, which was considered a sign of great wealth. Annie still felt the need to use her black magic skills and voodoo practices as a means of manipulating and controlling those around her. Sometimes, when her husband was absent from the house, she started taking male slaves for romance in her bedroom. Then she started taking slaves as lovers. More and more, her lust for the slave men grew until it could no longer be hidden. One day, John caught her engaging in sexual relations with one of the male slaves. He beat Annie and told her that she will be kicked out of Rose Hall if she ever had sexual relations again with those black slaves people. She was so embarrassed, and at the same time, she was very angry. So Annie swore to take her revenge on John and would never allow any man to control her again. Thus, Annie started using her black magic ability to poison and kill her husband. A few days later, John was found dead while drinking coffee. It was believed that she used her voodoo skills to poison him. Then, at the right moment, she put poison into his coffee and killed him. The slaves of Rose Hall plantation hated Annie and knew that she was involved in the mysterious deaths of her husbands. But Annie was never accused of her husband's death. Then she moved slowly to take over the business and took control of the plantation work. She then finally inherited all the fortune of Rose Hall and the plantation. Now she was free and could do whatever she wanted. Not long after, Annie wanted to take the property of another Englishman who owned a large plantation. So she started to use black magic to trap the Englishman into falling in love with her and to take all his wealth. Thus, a few days later, with the help of black magic, Annie was able to make the Englishman to fall in love with her. Then, she got married to the Englishman. But her new second husband could not satisfy her sexual desires. Then a few days later, her second husband was found dead under mysterious circumstances, of which she was never accused. But people believe that her second husband was killed by stabbing him while he was sleeping. She then poured boiling oil in his ears to make sure he was dead. Then she inherited all the property and wealth of her second husband. This is not the end. Annie is again married, this time for the third time. But once she started tiring of her third husband, she killed him by strangling him with the help of her slave lover, Taku. It is said all three husbands' dead bodies were buried under the 3 palm trees that sit in front of the Rose Hall house. After the deaths of each of her husbands, she continued taking male slaves as her lovers. When she grew tired of their service, she cursed them with black magic or killed them. She would regularly torture her slaves and even kill those who disobeyed her commands. She was also a jealous lover. If she felt her lovers looked at a slave girl, they were severely punished or even killed. She was a mean, cruel plantation mistress who tortured her slaves and treated them very poorly. Thus began her reign of terror, and as a result of her black magic skill, she was feared by everyone. She also reportedly used voodoo black magic to cast curses or control her slaves. Nobody knows why Annie was treating her slave very badly. But it was believed that when Annie was living in Haiti, the slaves had rebellions against the French colony and white people. During that rebellion, the slaves even hurt and killed not just the French people, but also other European white people. That war had made Annie feel very unsafe about staying on the island of Haiti and may have influenced her desire to leave when she turns 18 years old. It is possible that this may have been the origin of the cruelty that Annie felt for the slaves on the Rose Hall plantation. Annie could be heard shouting orders to her slaves from her balcony and putting anyone to death if they disobeyed her orders. She ruled the plantation her way. The black slaves could not bear her cruelty anymore. Some slaves tried to run away from the Rose Hall plantation. When Annie learned that some slaves were trying to escape, she set bear traps all around the property to catch the slaves who were attempting to escape. Whenever she caught those slaves who were trying to escape, she would throw the injured slaves in the dungeon below the house. She would not provide any food, not even a single drop of water as a punishment, and left the slave to die of starvation. Her cruelty was applied not only to adult slaves, but also to slave children. Those slave children of Rose Hall plantation were required to carry water to the house in a heavy wooden bucket, and if they spilled a single drop of water, they would be beaten and punished severely. Slaves who worked in the house and had access to the kitchen were required to whistle whenever they were around food so that she would know they were not taking any of the food in the kitchen without her permission. If they could not whistle when asked, it meant their mouth was full with food. So, if any slaves were caught not whistling when asked, she would cut their heads off as punishment for stealing and eating the food without her permission. Annie was also known to murder the newborn babies of her slaves so that she could use their bones for black magic. She would then perform rituals using the bones of babies she had murdered to increase her black magic power. She would often use her potions and black magic power to bring her slave lovers to her bed. She ruled and controlled the Rose Hall plantation out of fear. Due to her extreme cruelty and regular practice of black magic and voodoo to torture the black slave people, she was not considered a human, but rather a witch, and thus the slaves working at Rose Hall plantation started to call her the White Witch of Rose Hall. It seemed nothing could stop her, but one day her fate has arrived. Her reign of terror came to an end when she crossed another powerful magician, a slave named Taku. Annie never wanted to limit her lover to just one man. One day, a young Englishman started working on her plantation as an accountant. His name was Robert Rutherford. Annie fell immediately in love when she saw Robert, but Robert had no interest in her. Robert showed respect to Annie and considered her as the owner of the Rose Hall plantation. Since Robert does not fall in love with Annie, she started using her black magic power to make Robert fall in love with her. But this time her black magic power did not work on Robert. She was surprised because her black magic failed to work on Robert. So she started to investigate and found out that Robert only had eyes for a pretty young slave girl named Millicent. Annie became so mad and jealous at Millicent that she wanted to punish and get rid of her. Annie thought that if she could get rid of Millicent, Robert could easily fall in love with her. So Annie cast a black magic spell on Millicent known as an Old Hige. The spell Old Hige is a powerful black magic that was said to bring about a visit from a ghost. After the ghost visited the victim, it would cause the person to slowly wither and die. As a result of the black magic known as Old Hige, Millicent's body slowly withered and died from not taking any food or water. The way Millicent died made everyone believe that she died of starvation and not from Annie's black magic spell. Only one person knows who actually killed Millicent. His name was Taku, and he was the grandfather of the young slave girl, Millicent. Taku was also one of Annie's former slaves and lovers. Taku had actually been freed by Annie because she chose him to be her lover. He visited her bedroom every night and was very loyal to Annie. Little did Annie know about her former slave lover Taku was that he was also a local witch doctor who had knowledge of black magic and voodoo practices. So Taku knows all the secrets of Annie. Taku became so angry at the death of his granddaughter, Millicent, that he had enough and wanted to take revenge. At first, Taku started using black magic to weaken Annie's health. But she was able to protect herself from Taku's black magic spell. Taku would spend day and night practicing powerful black magic and casting a spell on Annie. After so much hard work, Taku was finally able to weaken Annie's health by using powerful black magic. While she was in a weakened state, Taku went inside Annie's room, pretending to love her, but instead he attacked her in her bedroom and strangled her neck. And thus the battle continued for a few moments, but in the end, Taku was able to kill Annie to death. Although after the battle was over, Taku too did not survive. Thus Annie died in the year 1846. Even in death, her slaves feared that Annie would use her powers from beyond the grave to attack them in her anger. So, the slaves took her body and buried it in a deep hole directly behind Rose Hall in a concrete tomb, designed to keep her spirit imprisoned forever, and her soul there for eternity. They then burned all her possessions for fear they might be infected by her spirit. A special black magic ritual was designed and performed to keep her spirit locked in, and to prevent her spirit from rising and escaping its deep grave. A special sign marked with crosses was placed on her concrete tomb to keep her spirit from wandering and haunting the land. But Annie's voodoo black magic was able to retain its power from beyond the grave. Her ghostly figure, dressed in white garments, started roaming at Rose Hall because she was unable to rest in peace. The slaves tried to investigate how Annie's spirit escaped the concrete tomb. The slaves were able to find out that the voodoo ritual performed to keep her spirit locked inside the deep grave was not fully completed and was not done correctly. This mistake allows the spirit of Annie to still walk the house and freely roam at the Rose Hall plantation to this day. She began to make ghostly appearances around Rose Hall, haunting the servants, visitors, and residents who came to Rose Hall with terror. Annie's murder coincided with a slave uprising that erupted in Jamaica in 1831. During the slave rebellion in Jamaica, most of the great houses that were owned by the white people were all burned down by the black slave people. It is believed that Rose Hall escaped the fate of most of the other great houses during the slave rebellion because the slaves believed that burning the house down would anger Annie's spirit and release Annie's spirit from the property, freeing it to go wherever it chose. It is also said that one guy who decided to buy Rose Hall property met with gruesome ends, and this is why the great house has stood empty for many years. It was claimed that Annie's ghost was responsible for the sudden and mysterious deaths of the proprietors, who immediately took over the property. In the early 1900s, there was another family that tried to live at Rose Hall. But one day, when the maid of the house was working on the second story of the building, she was thrown from a second-story balcony by invisible forces, killing the maid. The second-story balcony is the very spot where Annie herself would stand while she was alive and would enjoy the spectacle of her slaves being tortured, which occurred in front of the building ground below. After the death of the maid on the balcony, the new family immediately fled Rose Hall. The building lay in silent and ruin until the 1960s, that is for almost 130 years. It was then cleaned up, restored, and revived for public use as a historic house and plantation. Although employees of the newly refurbished Rose Hall house say they feel her spirit in and around the house. At night, visitors who came to Rose Hall could hear the voice of Annie Palmer along the corridors, the footsteps of her spirit walking through the rooms of the great house, and sometimes the sound of babies crying. Many tourists who came to visit the house also claim to have witnessed Annie Palmer's ghost, riding her horse at night around the plantation, looking for runaway slaves. Her ghostly figure has been seen standing on her balcony, still watching over the plantation even in death. Thus, the Rose Hall house in Jamaica is still haunted by the spirit of Annie, who is also known as the White Witch of Rose Hall.